90-pound rucksack. Story of the 10th Mountain Division and the dawn of outdoor recreation in America.
Hello, my name is David Murphy. I'm a military historian. I'm based in University of Maynooth in Ireland.
And you've written a book on the Soviet invasion of Finland.
Yes, recently I wrote on the Finnish-Soviet War of 1939 to 1940. It's usually referred to as the Winter War. So that was out in 2021.
Wonderful. So thank you for joining us here today. And we're very interested in hearing how the Soviets came to invade Finland on November 30th, 1939.
Sure. This is it's a bit of a long burn, so to speak. A lot of this comes down to Soviet Russian perceptions of Finland, and there are some modern parallels that one have to say as well with Ukraine. Finland had been part of the old Russian Empire pre-revolution. It is the Grand Duchy of Finland all the way up to 1917, 1918, and then after the Russian Revolution, it becomes a state of its own. Okay. And that is problematic for the Russians, and particularly getting into the 1930s, it's very problematic for Joseph Stalin, the Russian premier. He looks at this country that was historically had been Russian for a couple of hundred years. He looks at its border. He thinks it's too close to some of his key cities in Russia, Leningrad, and then also the ports up at Murmansk and Archangel. So doesn't like that. They also have fortifications on the Karelian Peninsula. Doesn't like that. That's very close to Leningrad. So those kind of ideas start factoring into the Soviet Russian thinking. Actually, in the mid 1930s, 1935, start developing a plan to invade Finland. They do a survey at the border and where they're going to go in. And when it actually happens, as we see in 1939, that's all kind of very rushed, very short-circuited in the context of the wider war in Europe. And in the context with, say, the Russian Nazi Germany pact at that time, they decide that it's a good time to go. Let's take over Russia, or let's take over Finland, and they also have factored in they're occupying half of Poland. They want to take the Baltic states as well. So it's something that it's a 20-year concern, so to speak, for Soviet Russia and for Stalin. But then the need for buffer states between them and the rest of Europe really accelerates this process from the 1930s onwards, particularly in 1938, 1939.
How did the Soviets go from being mortal enemies with Germany to signing the pact immediately preceding the invasion?
I get that question a lot. It's a very unusual. I mean, ideologically, they are both at kind of like disparate ends, totally different ends of the political spectrum. But actually, already from the 1920s, they start getting involved in these mutual military kind of training organizations. They run maneuvers together. There's a lot of kind of to and fro with military observers going backwards and forwards. The Russians allow the Germans train with tanks in their territory, also with military aircraft in their territory, because the Germans are banned from doing all this under the Versailles Accord. So you would imagine, superficially, you would actually say that these two regimes actually cannot get along, but they are gradually getting more hand in hand through the late 20s into the early 1930s. And then in August of 1939, they signed what we refer to as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, named after the two foreign ministers. And essentially, it's a secret meeting. We only get full details of that after the war and after the fall of the Soviet Union. But essentially, Germany and Russia had decided how they're going to divvy out all of Europe between themselves. And in the context of what we're talking about today, essentially Russia is to get the Baltic states, it's to get Finland, and it's to get Romania, and it's also to get half of Poland. That's quite often that's overlooked in the history of the outbreak of World War II. Germany invades Poland in September 1939, and that brings in Britain and France in a war against it. But in the middle of September, the Soviet Union occupies basically the eastern half of the country and takes half of it over, which is strategically it's a very difficult place for the rest of the allies. Now, they had been looking to Russia as a potential ally, but in 1939, late 1939, they've really shown their hands that they're very much in bed with Nazi Germany at that time.
And so the Soviets invade Finland. Can you talk a little bit about the invasion itself?
Sure. I mean, essentially, what happens is there's a there are a series of demands, like demanding territory back, basically from all along Finland's borders, and that runs out throughout the summer. There's diplomacy all the way through the summer of and into the autumn of 1939. Those diplomatic relations break down in the middle of November. At 1939, and about 13 days later, the Russians go in. They announced their intention. There's no declaration of war, but there is an air raid into Helsinki at the rail station at Helsinki to catch people going to work during rush hour. Very similar to some of the stuff we've seen recently in Ukraine. So that kind of timing, and that basically announces then there essentially a move on the Karelian Peninsula, also kind of like all the border, all the way up into the Arctic Circle. Four main thrusts into Finnish territory. Some of the northern one initially goes well, but essentially what you can say through all the rest of the Russian operation um, slows down, gets bogged down either between forts or because of the topography, because of the lakes and the forests. And then when we get into winter, you throw into the fact that they're being slowed down in these kind of like forested areas, and the Finns are now starting to chop their people up. So it all comes down by December of 1939. It's at stalemate for the Russians. And they thought this was going to go very fast. They had this planned out. They had a plan on paper that looked good. They put together formations that were essentially conscripted, very hastily conscripted and untrained troops. So they short-wired their entire planning. And then they send their people into basically Arctic winter without any proper equipment. They do send army units with brass bands because they're planning on a victory parade. So and the Finns are kind of like when they capture some of this equipment, they're kind of going, it does not compute. They don't have winter clothing, but somebody brought along the band. That's that kind of madness. Yeah.
Can you describe a little bit the initial deployment of the Soviets as well as the ramp up, and then I'd love to know more about the Finns. What did they have to respond with?
Sure. I mean, when you look at this on paper, and you can see this in journalism at the time, I mean, the Finnish numbers for this war, maximum would be about 350,000 people, max. The Russians will initially go in with about 400,000. They will ramp that up to 750,000, 760,000, and they will eventually ramp that up over a million. So the numbers game is just, you would look at this on paper and say, that's it, the Finns have had it. I think the Finns also have at that time air power is going to be has a major role in World War II, obviously. The Finns have about 80 serviceable aircraft, whereas the Russians have thousands. The Finns have something less than 20 modern tanks. And again, the Soviets have thousands. So on paper, it just looks bad. But what actually happens is like in the Karelian, if anyone finds a map and looks at the Karelian Peninsula, and that it's kind of like a strip of land between the Baltic Sea and the big lake. Uh, the Russians get bogged down there because there's a line of fortifications known as the Mannerheim line. It's named after the Finnish minister and also the senior Finnish general. He was a very flinty kind of character, Karl von Mannerheim. So it's named after him. They get bogged down there. Okay. Then moving slightly kind of like further on to the
When
east.
is this? Is this December?
This is immediately that is an immediate focus of operations is the Mannerheim line, because if you break it, you could basically just swing west and you're down into Helsinki and the war's over.
And can you
And this
describe
is
the
what they're factoring
landscape?
in. Sorry.
Can you describe the landscape and the
Yeah,
climate
the
at that point?
landscape. Basically, you've got a very limited road infrastructure through that, so that's going to create pinch points. It is forested to some degree, but what's a major problem is our water features, rivers, lakes, boglands, and that essentially funnels the Soviet forces into killing zones that then basically are targeted by the Finnish fortifications. So this is supposed to be a couple of weeks of an operation breakthrough, swing left, Helsinki, and essentially the whole thing actually fails. It stalls there.
And what are the temperatures like? What are the snows?
You're heading into it starts off. I mean, you're looking at say late November. You're heading into Finnish winter. The deepest recorded temperatures are -40 Celsius. But I don't know what that translates to in Fahrenheit. Around the same, I suppose, in Fahrenheit. But it's those kind of, those kind of deep cold scenarios. Lakes are frozen, so there's just so much in this. Lakes are frozen, rivers are frozen. The Finns use them to move around. They kind of like cross over frozen lakes. When the Russians try it, the Finns tend to blow up the ice and drown them. So they're aware of how they can use the landscape, and the Finns are also aware how they can use the landscape against the Russians. So they will try something when the Russians try it, they'll just mess them up.
And
So yeah, basically that the initial offensive in the Mannerheim line fails. They're then trying to maneuver kind of like further east. There's a large lake complex. You try to maneuver in around there, and the lakes and the defenses stop them there. Okay, and then basically you're looking at they try a further thrust further north to cut the country in half, and that's the one that goes into the forested road systems and basically gets cut up by Finnish troops. So whatever the Russians try to press in, either the topography shuts them down, but then also kind of like Russian counter or Finnish countermeasures and firepower messes them up in a major way as well.
can you help us understand a little bit about the Finnish cultural pastimes of skiing and how they use that to navigate the terrain when the Soviets invaded?
Sure. I mean, culturally, uh, and this still exists in Finland. There's a huge kind of like population and enjoy outdoor sports in terms of like it's one end, like hunting in the winter months, but also the skiing, cross country skiing, skating, and just basically going outside to, I suppose, test your own survival skills in the winter months. The Finns seem to operate in a system, and this is true today, I think, that regardless of how bad the weather is, that's no excuse not to get outdoors and do stuff. Okay, so that's what we do. So when you have people, and even again urban dwellers, it's a predominantly rural population, but even urban dwellers, people living in the big cities, they like to get out into the country and go climbing and go skiing or whatever. So your entire population, male and female, can do this kind of stuff and as proficient on skiing and cross country skiing.
Can you
So factor
contrast?
that into, sorry,
Can you contrast that with the Soviet personnel that were coming in?
the Soviet personnel that are actually coming in, and there are reports of this. They tended to be like some of the main units were city dwellers from Leningrad. So you're looking at people who are kind of like urban dwellers, do not do this. Like factory workers who are not being overly employed, who are conscripted into these kind of like ad hoc kind of like units at very short notice. They are not trained. They are not trained in outdoor survival. They are not equipped. Okay, and that is a key thing. Winter clothing, cooking facilities, shelter facilities. They do not even have winter camouflage. I mean, you do not go in white. The Finns show up wearing white capes and white outfits. They paint their equipment white. The Russians don't do that. So, like it's very, very easy to target them as they move through the Finnish countryside.
And how were the Finns taking care of their troops, and how were the Soviets taking care of theirs?
Well, there's a considerable amount of care on the Finnish side. Basically, if you look at how they're a Finnish unit, at say a company level, every company has the facility to provide hot tenting. I mean, hot tenting, hot camping has become very, very popular, especially if you're living in and kind of like engaged in outdoor activities in very cold climates. But the Finns can do that. So if somebody is in the line on duty, he can come back for a period of rest in the heated area and get a hot meal and a hot drink. In some areas, the Finns actually even build ad hoc saunas. Okay, so that guys can have the joys of a sauna at the end of a long, hard day of killing Russians. Um, the flip side of the coin is totally true on the Russian side. Um, Seemingly, the Russians find it very, very hard to survive. They have no winter clothing, no camouflage clothing. They do not have cooking facilities. And this becomes a key thing as well, that the Finns start targeting field kitchens, Russian field kitchens, and taking them out so that the Russians are not only cold, but they're also starving. Okay. So when you contrast the two, like the Finns they're quite a small unit level. They can keep warm, they can keep fed. Okay. And the big centralized Russian system is you would have a battalion there. There's a battalion field kitchen. If that gets taken out, nobody's getting fed, nobody's shod properly, nobody's dressed properly. So it's just bad news. It's nightmarish scenario.
Can you share some anecdotes from the invasion and the resistance of the Finnish guerrilla soldiers that can help our listeners understand a little bit of the character of the war?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing to think about that when the Russians start coming in, uh, there is a scorched earth element. So the Russian army will start moving in on certain axes. The Finns will go out and kill livestock. Will burn down basically every habitation. So there's no shelter. There's not so much as an outhouse for somebody to take shelter, and they lay waste to the whole area of Finland as the Russians are pushing into it. I think what are always interesting in within this, and it says something about the Finnish character. You get civilians who do this themselves. They're kind of like the Finnish army moves up to evacuate some old men, some old women from locations, and those people are actually burning down their own farms and killing their own livestock, and making sure that nothing's left for the Russian invader, which is incredible. I mean, it's such a tough life, rural Finland at that period in those areas, and you've got people who are maybe have spent 20 years building up a farm operation, and then they decide, no, I'm actually burning the whole lot of this down. Nothing's going to be left for us. So I think that's an interesting thing to start with. But then when you actually have military on military, so to speak, when it gets tactical, um, the Finnish troops can essentially just maneuver around much better through the forests. They can do cross country skiing, so they will maneuver along kind of like frozen rivers up quite close to Russian columns. In many cases, the forest comes right to the edge of the road. Okay, and if you can imagine, and the roads are so narrow, there's no turning points really, are very irregular turning points. So you've got a Russian column essentially facing westwards, invading in, strung out along a road. And next thing, presumably in the night, groups of Finns started showing up, ambushing and shooting scoots, or they break out into the column, destroy a certain entity, build build a roadblock. So they actually cut maybe a divisional column down into 6 or 8 different parts. They call this motti. Motti is a measure of firewood. It's a yard, a cubic yard of firewood. So this idea of breaking the big column down to small bits, and then what they actually do then over the succeeding nights is just eat up each part of it separately. It allows them, they don't have mass, they don't have numbers. So they can break down the Russian mass into a smaller element and then eat one up on a night by night basis. Huge psychological. Obviously, for the Russians, this is hugely psychological problem. Apart from the practical stuff, the mental aspect of this, and we don't have a huge amount of counts from Russian soldiers, but there are some, and they do describe the nightmarish kind of like scenario. And there's one particular officer who survives and leaves us an account, and he talks about, say, some night they put out sentries. Okay, they put out sentries, and the next morning all their sentries are either dead or missing. Dead or Okay, so the next night they put out sentries, maybe increase the sentries. Next morning they wake up, they find that the Russians have actually bypassed the sentries this time and come into the camp to kill 10 or 20 guys.
The
And
Finns,
you've got people, sorry?
the Finns have bypassed the Russian
Yeah,
sentries.
the Finns have bypassed the Russian sentries, left the sentries alone to come into the camp and kill people and then leave again. And you had like people waking up in a sleeping bag, and the guy next to them in the sleeping bag is dead because he's been killed during the night. Now, psychologically, that is just. I mean, I don't think you have to have been in the military or experienced combat to think about what that would actually bring to your life in that scenario. Um, and then also using things like frozen Russian bodies as signposts with kind of Finland this way, um, Helsinki this way to Helsinki, um, nightmares. So that is the quality of the fighting, and up in really in the high north. I mean, the Russians go in around a place called Petsamo, and that's to do with mining activity, but it's also Finland's outlet into the Arctic. Um, but that goes into hours of our days of permanent darkness because it's above the Arctic Circle. So that is, you have all this other stuff going on, and it's also 24 hours a day is dark. So factor that into your experience. Yes, no, I will not be volunteering.
What sort of temperatures were they experiencing at this point?
It's down again. You'd have to call it like in Celsius minus mid 30s, minus 40 Celsius.
And how are the Finns dressed?
Uh, interesting. I mean, some of them, they obviously, basically their army is split a few different ways, but the kind of like the permanently constituted army kind of like would show up in kind of like army uniforms and would also have a snow camouflage, snow overalls, okay, and kind of like hats and woolens and mittens and that. Some of the guys who were activated as reserves or civic guard will come wearing their civilian clothes and will only have the weapon and will only have, say, a national badge, a cockade on their hat to identify them. So looking at them, they're almost civilian. They tend to be all then pick up kind of like the white overall equipment when they can. In some ways, those guys are better off because they get to bring their own skiing kit, their own mountaineering kit, their own hunting kit with them. Stuff that they've tried out over years and they know it works and they know they can survive and stay warm. So in some ways, the guys who do not get the kind of like the full range of what's available to the military are actually a little bit better off in terms of their kit. You know, I'm sure there's plenty of people in the military or maybe even in the 10th Mountain can relate to that. If you were allowed to bring a selection of your own personal kit, would you be a little bit more comfortable on campaign or whatever? So that's what's the big. But I mean, when it breaks down, I mean, in terms of what they have weapons wise, every soldier has a bolt action rifle. The Finnish have a version. The Moisen Nagant rifle they developed themselves. Their version is better than the Russian version. They also have some light machine guns, heavy machine guns, all kind of quite archaic kind of stuff. They will capture an awful lot of material from the Russians, up to and including tanks and planes, and they will recycle that and use that again. But in terms of artillery, all artillery, I don't think they have anything that is post World War One. Essentially, they've inherited kind of Russian artillery from World War One. They have some modern anti-tank weapons, but not enough. And that then means that they go into a whole, um, what would you say, a whole phase of improvised anti-tank kind of like operations. Um, but rifle and some support weapons, but they are not, there's not an abundance of kit on the Finnish side.
And how would you contrast that with the Soviet troops?
But there's so much stuff they don't know what to do with it. In terms of, uh, their people are going forward with obviously personal weapons, lots of support weapons. They cannot bring in. It's a bit the same like the Ukrainian thing at the moment. They cannot seem to make that felt. Okay, they cannot like they'll come forward with abundance of artillery, heavy machine guns. They cannot make that feel itself against the Finns, and it's purely due to the Finns being able to camouflage themselves. The Finns don't dig in unless they're back in the tree line, uh, and the Russians cannot uh, basically synchronize their artillery onto Finnish positions. They cannot synchronize their air power and close air support. They cannot make that felt on the Finnish positions. That's the so weapon see.
Is there go on.
So I was just going to say, in terms of how the Russians use tanks, a very cavalry mindset. And in the early phases, the tanks dash forward without infantry support. Again, quite similar to what we see in the Ukraine. Uh, and the Finns just developed various methods for dealing with that and taking out huge numbers of Russian tanks. Very, very similar.
Is there a particular sortie that you could describe that would help us understand the Finnish tactics?
Yeah, I think the key one that people always look in at in December, an action develops along a location. It's kind of in the middle of Finland, in the middle of the frontier, along a road that's known as the Rat Road or AATE, the Rat Road. And essentially, you've got two divisions uh, pushing their way in there along a very, very narrow road, uh, but primarily the 44th Soviet Division, Rifle Division. Um, and it is a prime example of this. They have a very, very narrow access along this road. They reach a point, they basically cross over a lake, and the Finns have put in a roadblock. Okay. And so they get stalled on that. They're all stretched in one direction. Then the Finns start coming into the column and breaking that column into smaller lumps. Okay. Just break it down. And then essentially you break it down to maybe 8 different parts. And then in the succeeding couple of weeks, they just do this attritive process. They will every night their parties will ski up and shoot up the column. They will ski up and kind of like set fire to tanks, throw in Molotov cocktails, demolish stuff, and they will just do this gradually over a couple of weeks until that division, now slightly under strength, it's about 8,000 people. That just disappears, ceases to be. ceases to be, the 44th Soviet Rifle Division. And there's one back along the road past that gets a similar treatment. So I think if you Google do Google images for Winter War, you will come across these photographs of trucks spawned out at the side of the road, stacks of bodies, etc., etc. Quite often that is actually a particular action, the Rat Road. Um, and a lot of those photographs actually taken by an American journalist, Carl Maidens. He was active up there covering the war. But I think that's the one that sums it up for everybody, I think.
Mhm. And you mentioned the Molotov cocktail, and this is a relatively new addition to
Yeah.
the Finnish arsenal. Can you
So
describe the origin of that?
yeah, apparently they have been in use since the mid 30s from the Spanish Civil War. But the Finns really kind of like make them their own, and they used them as anti-personnel devices. They used them quite effectively against tanks. And essentially, I mean, it actually gets so bad, the Russians target by air one of the bottle factories that they realize they're picking up these bottles with a certain factory stamp on it. So they actually target this location to try and destroy the bottles. But it's so simple. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen one or seeing one made or thought about making one at some stage in our life. But half a bottle full of petrol, and like sometimes you will add in something like sugar as well to make it sticky, to make it a bit kind of like a napalm kind of device. Light and drag in the neck, light and throw. That's very very simple, very very effective. Um, Regardless of what case you use it. I mean, it's used against anti-tank, it's used anti-personnel. Later on in the fighting, there's some street fighting, and the Russians are kind of like coming in on streets, and the Finns are up on the roofs, lobbing these things down on them. And the Finns also develop a kind of a contact charge that you tape on the outside of the bottle, so you don't have to light anything. All you have to do is throw it, and the contact will actually ignite the whole thing. So yeah, the Finns christened these Molotov cocktails because the Russian foreign minister is Molotov. So they name in African. They name various bits and pieces in derision after Molotov. But that's the only one we remember is the Molotov cocktail.
And can you tell me about Simo Heha?
It's Simo Heha. It's pronounced Simo Halha. All I'd say is don't ever try and learn Finnish. To anybody listening, if you don't speak Finnish, don't try and learn it. It's an inscrutable language. I actually think I don't think it's a real language at all. I think they all speak English, and they actually just pretend to speak Islam. Sorry, no disrespect to Finnish speakers there. But yes, Simo Haya or Simo Halha is in many ways he's a typical Finnish infantryman. He works in the outdoors. He kind of like he's worked in a rural scenario. He is activated as a reservist. He is an excellent shot. Okay, he's an excellent shot. And I will put this in the context. He's using the standard infantry rifle, which is not scoped. There are very few scoped weapons in the Finnish side, and they will capture some scoped weapons from the Russians. So you're talking about somebody shooting open sights, iron sights, and he will also use. They have an SMG, a submachine gun known as the Sumi SMG. He will use that for really close work. I mean, talking creeping up to somebody within 50 yards. But all in all, he will his score, his count in the course of the war is over 500, which puts him 500 confirmed, which puts him as the highest scoring sniper in world history, as far as I'm aware. And he gets very badly injured later on in the war, gets hit in the face with an explosive bullet. Okay. That's a kind of a life-changing injury for him, but he goes back, uh, survives the war, goes back home. He doesn't die until 2002. Yeah. But hard as nails, carved out a walnut, this man, and most of his stuff was just, he went out alone, no spotter, personally alone, and tracked up onto Russian positions, started taking them out, or would pick up the end of a column moving through the woods and just gradually trip the back of the column up. But using an open sight rifle uh, for maybe 100 to 200 yards, uh, creeping up with an SMG on occasions for 50 yards or less.
Was he using skis to approach these
Oh yeah,
targets?
he's moving all the time. See, this is it. He does live in a rural setting, so this is how in wintertime, this is how he moves around. So he can survive by himself for days on end, in those conditions, and he can move around as he wishes. So and he's camouflaged. He's wearing a white camouflaged kind of like smock effect, so he can camouflage himself as well. And you see, there's some photographs of Finnish snipers as well. So they have the camouflage suit, the hood, and also a face mask with only really kind of like a mouth slit and two eyes, and that's so it covers the face.
Incredible. And so the invasion begins in November. At the end of November, we go through the achingly cold temperatures of December, and it's a war of attrition, and one in which the Soviets cannot leverage their superior firepower to make any advantage on the Finns. And then what happens?
Well, there's a couple. I mean, the Finns are obviously playing for time, and as I said earlier on, there was consistent talk from the French and the British that they were gonna mount an intervention, which never happens. Never happens. Um, but they're playing for time, hoping that this is actually that somebody's going to come and rescue them. Doesn't happen. So what you actually see in a couple of things significant happen on the Russian side. A new commander is appointed, and it's a guy called Timoshenko. And anybody who's studied Eastern Front in World War II will recognize the name. Timoshenko is one of the two big, I suppose, two most successful Soviet World War II commanders. Okay. So he's appointed essentially to get the act together against Finland. And he does certain, first of all, he bring in some, better trained troops and better trained NCOs, and they start a whole training process with the Russian army, basically retrain it. Within that, they lay out rehearsal areas so the guys can actually do rehearse attacks, particularly and lay out kind of like mock fortifications, like what we see at the Mannerheim line. So they rehearse breaking the Mannerheim line. He's also much better in using his armor and his air power. Crucially, Timoshenko trains up a whole generation of forward fire observers for both artillery and close air support. And all of that is then going to be felt in basically February, March of 1940. Eventually, what will happen is it becomes more increasingly desperate for the Finns on all fronts. But what essentially significantly happens is that the Russians eventually in March do break through the Mannerheim line. So all they have to really do is push up to a particular road, swing a left, and they're heading down to Helsinki. And at that stage, we're looking at kind of like at a peace process, and it comes to a ceasefire. I think it's interesting, actually. I looked at some of the documents on the British side, and even within a couple of days of the kind of like the ceasefire between the Finns and the Russians, Mannerheim is still trying to get weapons and get equipment and support um, from the Allied side, but nothing can come quickly enough for him.
Mm. When Timoshenko was retraining the troops, did they bring into consideration any of the winter warfare tactics employed by the Finns?
They do. I mean, essentially, what they do is they look at their kind of like their equipment stock as well. So the issue guys with white, camouflage clothing. And there's some of the Russian survivors will talk about this as well. They said by the time I kind of got issued with my white kit, it was coming into spring and there was no need for it anymore. So the issue the guys with the equipment that they have, they start looking at they start looking at countermeasures in terms of how they can break down kind of small groups of the Finnish infiltrators. There's another backstory to this. There's a whole booby trapping war in this. The Finns are very good at laying booby traps, and the Russians start countermanding or counteracting those. And then even just a simple thing, how they use their armor, they start sending it with, start ending their infantry support with the Russian armor. So that kind of like negates the Finns from destroying so many tanks. So just a couple of quick tactical changes, a couple of better rehearsal and some equipment changes really give the Soviets the upper hand then in the last weeks of this war.
And so we've got this all unfolding on a global stage, and the world is watching the Soviet invasion and its inability to penetrate the way it expected to in Finland. How does that play out in the various considerations of the forces around the world?
Yeah, I mean, it plays out in various different ways. I mean, like if you track the press coverage in this, it's very obvious that this is a huge boost in morale for kind of the French and the British this period, because they kind of look at the German operation into Poland, and they're asking themselves, how are we going to, how are we basically going to fight this blitzkrieg form of warfare? And all of a sudden, you have this relatively small nation with obsolescent equipment, uh, basically facing down a major military power that is supposedly one of the leaders in mechanized armored warfare in the world, and they're facing them down. So it's a huge morale boost, a huge morale boost. And then there's fundraising, there's fundraising issues to kind of raise money for Finland. There are about 12,000 volunteers go to fight for the Finns, including about 300 Americans. Okay, about 300 Americans. An international brigade, so to speak, go to fight. Swedes, predominantly, a lot of Swedes, but also French, Brits, about 300 Americans. One of the British ones is Christopher Lee, who anybody who has he's what is he? He's Saruman in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Anybody has he was Dracula. You can date yourself by how you know Christopher Lee. He's either Dracula or he's in Lord of the Rings. But he's one of the British volunteers. Um, on a practical level, though, all the militaries look at this, and what you'll see and again, you can find actually instruction manuals talking about this. Uh, when the British are thinking about they're going to be invaded whenever else, they start sending in instructions. Look, guys, this is how you will deal with enemy tanks, and it's Molotov cocktails, and it's it's that kind of anti-tank stuff. This is how you use your small arms in terms of finding pinch points, ambushes, sniping. So a lot of the 1939, 1940 kind of discussion, say in the British setting, is how we will use Finnish type tactics if the Germans start landing into Britain. And also then going on, when you look at, say, British, say, not airborne, but definitely their commando training takes place up in Scotland in locations that are as cold as possible. And they will kind of like try to develop kind of like cross-country ski, climbing, snowshoeing kind of like capabilities. And these are when the British eventually do an intervention into Norway, that it's that commando group that goes. So the influence is particularly into British training, and also kind of the French kind of like have Alpine chasseurs. The French always have these kind of like specific Alpine units. They are given an upgrade. They're increased in size. And I suppose on the other side of the coin as well, in the German side, the German have mountain troops, Gebirgsjäger. They have divisions of those pre-World War II. Uh, they intensify their training, intensify recruitment, and they basically increase the scope of those mountain troops in the German army. And these are the troops then that would be, especially in that Arctic front, these are the people who will actually be fighting the Russians then later on in World War II, opposite Stalingrad, or opposite Leningrad, actually, not Stalingrad. So basically, there's a refocusing on surviving and operating in those kind of environments. And I suppose there's a recognition in all this that there will be action in subarctic conditions during the course of the war, either in Russia or up in the northern countries, and that really plays out.
And how I understand there were some Americans that were embedded as well, journalists as well as military attachés. How did they report back what they were finding? And how did that influence American considerations of winter warfare on this side of the Atlantic?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple of layers here. I mean, there's an American military mission in Helsinki throughout this, so they are reporting back on what they're seeing, and it's actually those who are actually taking the requests for our equipment and the Finns, etc. So they're reporting. There are military officers based in Helsinki, American military officers, reporting back what they're seeing. Okay, but that's the start. There are also American volunteers, about 300 of them, embedded into the Finnish army and the Finnish kind of like reserve forces. They have an experience. They report back, and then couple of different journalists, in particular, Carl Meidens and also Martha Gellhorn, who will later go on to have a significant World War II journalistic career. And she'll become a partner of Ernest Hemingway and whatever else later on in her life. She reports back from day one of the war. So all that, it's coming back at official levels. It's coming back in kind of letters from the front kind of aspect. But the journalism and the official stuff basically takes hold in American media, in the print media, and you've got some newsreel as well. And my understanding in that is then leads into that conversation about the 10th Mountain Division, that basically US Army has to have this capacity. We have to marry up these kind of like capacities of surviving and moving in Arctic conditions, and marry that onto standard military training to give us a competence in this area. Because again, when you look where America is 1940, 1941, the future's unsure. Who are you going to be fighting? Are you going to be fighting? Will the Russian-German pact continue? Will you find yourself, say, fighting Russians in Alaska? Is that what the future's going to be? We don't know that until 1941. All options are open. So Germany and Russia staying together, and Russia's kind of putting in a landing into Alaska is not totally off the cards. So if that is the case, you need troops to operate in that environment, and that is going to be tent man, at least initially.
Excellent.
Does that make sense?
It does, yes. Are there any specific examples of military hierarchy, military brass that are receiving this sort of information that are then deciding how to proceed vis-a-vis a mountain troop of our own?
In terms of the American tent man, apart from that gentleman Dole, who I know kind of puts pressure in on, I suppose, who's your um, chief of the combined staffs, is it Marshall at that time?
Marshall.
I think that conversation's going on, but to be honest, that's a bit beyond my remit, Christian. I don't know. I think I have a similar situation that you remarked upon earlier on. I keep finding this thread of kind of like it getting American attention, Dole then moving towards Tent Mountain Division, but who he's talking to specifically in America.
We can help you with that. We'll be
Yeah.
covering that in later episodes of the podcast. David, my many thanks to you for sharing your great expertise on the Winter War with us. Where can listeners find your book?
Oh, well, it's on Amazon. It's in all good bookshops. It is part of the Osprey campaign series. And it's just I don't know if people will see this, but it is the Finnish-Soviet Winter War, 1939 to 40. And some artwork in that. Johnny Shumat. I'll give a shout out to Johnny Shumat, American artist, who provided the artwork for that as well. So all good bookshops and Amazon.
David, thank you so much. Enjoy your Friday. Okay, take care.